December 20th, 1943, 11:47 a.m., 27,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. The metallic taste of cordite filled Hauptmann Klaus Weber's mouth as he squeezed the trigger of his MG 151-20 cannon. Through the oil-streaked plexiglass of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6, he watched his high-explosive shells tear into the American bomber's nose section like a scythe through wheat. Glass, aluminum, and what looked like pieces of human remains exploded outward in a crimson mist that splattered across his windscreen. Weber had made this shot 47 times before. Destroy the cockpit, kill the pilots, watch the flying fortress spiral into the German countryside below. It was a formula that had earned him the Knight's Cross and a reputation as one of the Luftwaffe's most deadly interceptor pilots. But as the smoke cleared from his perfect shot, something impossible happened. The B-17 kept flying. Have you ever witnessed something so fundamentally wrong that your brain simply refused to process it? Something that violated every law of physics you thought you understood? This is the story of how a dead bomber became the most terrifying sight in the European theater. Not for the Americans, but for the German aces who encountered it. Because sometimes, the most frightening enemy is the one that refuses to die. Weber was the Luftwaffe's definition of Aryan perfection. 26 years old, blonde hair cropped short beneath his leather flying helmet, ice blue eyes that had tracked and killed 47 Allied aircraft. He wore his Knight's Cross like a talisman, believing with religious fervor in German technological superiority and pilot training. American bomber crews were amateurs in Weber's mind. Farm boys and factory workers pressed into service, flying predictable formations in aircraft that were little more than flying coffins. The B-17 flying fortress might look intimidating with its bristling gun turrets, but Weber knew its weaknesses. Hit the cockpit to kill the brain, target the engines to cripple the body, aim for the fuel tanks to create the funeral pyre. It was a doctrine that had never failed him. The morning air at 27,000 feet carried the familiar cocktail of aviation fuel, gun oil, and his own adrenaline, the perfume of aerial warfare that Weber had grown to love. Through his headset, he could hear the steady growl of his Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, the mechanical heartbeat that had carried him through 3 years of combat over Europe. Achtung! Bomber formation at 2 o'clock high. Weber's voice crackled through the radio to his swarm of 4 Messerschmitts. Approximately 30 B-17s light escort. We take the lead bomber and work our way back through the formation. Weber banked his fighter toward the incoming American formation, the morning frost on his canopy, catching the December sunlight like scattered diamonds. Below, the German countryside stretched out in a patchwork of snow-covered fields and dark forests. Above, contrails from the American bombers painted white scars across the winter sky. He selected his target with the practiced eye of a predator, the lead B-17 of the high squadron, its olive-drab paint scheme stark against the pale sky. The bomber's nose art depicted a scantily clad woman with All-American 3 painted in flowing script below her. Weber could see the aircraft's crew through the plexiglass nose. The bombardier hunched over his Norden bomb sight. The navigator bent over his charts. Soon they would be dead. Beginning attack run, Weber transmitted, pushing his stick forward into a shallow dive that would bring him in on the bomber's port quarter. The B-17's defensive guns opened up at 800 meters. Too early, as always. Green tracers streaked past his canopy like angry hornets, but Weber held his course with the calm precision of a surgeon. At 400 meters, he could see individual rivets on the bomber's aluminum skin. The ball turret gunner was tracking him, the twin 50 caliber machine guns swiveling to follow his approach. Weber could even make out the gunner's face through the turret's plexiglass. A young man, probably no older than 20, eyes wide with fear and determination. Weber squeezed his cannon trigger. The MG 151-20 roared to life, sending a stream of 20mm high explosive shells directly into All-American 3's nose section. Weber watched with professional satisfaction as his rounds found their mark with devastating precision. The plexiglass nose cone erupted in a brilliant flash of orange and white flame. Chunks of aluminum and steel tumbled away into the slipstream like confetti from a deadly celebration. Through his gun sight, Weber could see the destruction clearly. The entire cockpit section forward of the wing root had simply vanished. Where moments before there had been pilots, instruments, and controls, now there was only twisted metal framework and empty space. Severed control cables whipped in the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream, like the severed arteries of some great mechanical beast. "Treffer!" Weber shouted into his radio. Direct hit. But his celebration died in his throat as he pulled up from his attack run. The B-17 didn't falter, didn't drop out of formation, didn't even waver. All-American 3 maintained perfect formation position with its squadron, its 4 Wright R-1820 engines humming steadily, its control surfaces making subtle adjustments as if responding to invisible hands. Through the gaping hole where the cockpit had been, Weber could see straight through to the sky beyond. Yet the bomber flew on with mechanical precision. Weber's hands began to tremble on his controls, something that hadn't happened since his first combat mission 2 years ago. "Derich, Hans, did you see that?" Weber keyed his radio to his wingman, Unteroffizier Hans Müller. "The lead bomber. I destroyed the cockpit completely." "Yeah, Klaus, I saw the hit. Excellent shooting. The army is finished." "Look again, Hans. Look again." There was a pause as Müller banked his Messerschmitt for a better view of the bomber formation. When his voice came back over the radio, it was tight with confusion. "Mein Gott, it's still flying. How is it still flying?" Weber dove for another pass, this time approaching from the bomber's starboard side. As he drew closer, the full scope of the impossibility became clear. The entire nose section forward of the wing root was gone, not damaged but completely obliterated. The cockpit, pilot and co-pilot seats, instrument panel, and primary flight controls had been vaporized by his cannon fire. Yet All-American 3's propellers continued their steady 4-beat rhythm. The aircraft held its position in the formation with unwavering precision. Most unnervingly, Weber could see the bomber's control surfaces, elevators, rudder, ailerons, making continuous micro-adjustments as if responding to pilot input. But there was no pilot, there was no cockpit. There was nothing but empty space and twisted metal where the aircraft's brain should have been. Weber's wingman, Unteroffizier Fritz Kellner, had joined the attack. His voice crackled over the radio, high-pitched with disbelief. "Herr Hauptmann, I'm seeing something impossible here. That bomber has no nose, no cockpit, but it's flying like nothing happened. The control surfaces are moving like someone's still at the controls." "I know what I'm seeing, Fritz," Weber replied, his own voice strained. "But I don't understand it." Weber consulted his mental database of bomber vulnerabilities, accumulated through 3 years of aerial combat. He knew the B-17's weaknesses intimately. The vulnerable oil coolers beneath the engines, the unprotected fuel tanks in the wings, the concentration of vital systems in the cockpit area. He had studied captured aircraft manuals, interrogated downed American aircrew, analyzed gun camera footage frame by frame. According to every piece of intelligence the Luftwaffe possessed, a B-17 flying fortress required constant pilot input to maintain formation flight. The aircraft was inherently unstable in certain flight regimes and would quickly depart controlled flight without active management. The technical specifications were unambiguous. No bomber could fly without human control for more than 30 to 45 seconds. Yet here was All-American 3, now 5 minutes after losing its cockpit, still maintaining perfect formation discipline with its squadron. Weber made a third pass, this time approaching from directly ahead in a head-on attack. As he closed the distance, he could see straight through the bomber's destroyed nose section, like looking through a tunnel. Sunlight streamed through the gaping hole where the cockpit had been. Torn wiring hung like mechanical intestines from the bomber's wounded fuselage. The twisted remains of the pilot's seat were barely recognizable as anything that had once supported human life. But the most disturbing detail was what he could see in the bomber's waist section. Crew members moving about their duties, apparently unaware that their aircraft was being flown by ghosts. The waist gunners were at their positions, tracking Weber's approach with their .50 caliber machine guns. The ball turret gunner continued his methodical search for targets. "Fritz, can you see the crew in the waist section?" Weber asked. "Ja, Herr Hauptmann. They're still at their battle stations. The gunners are tracking us like nothing's wrong. How can they not know their pilots are dead?" Weber's ammunition counter showed 47 rounds remaining for his cannon. Luftwaffe doctrine called for him to continue the attack until the bomber was destroyed, or he ran out of ammunition. But how do you destroy something that appears to already be dead? He lined up for another attack run, this time targeting the bomber's number 2 engine. His cannon shells struck home with devastating accuracy, sending pieces of engine cowling spinning away into the void. The propeller on the number 2 engine shuddered, then began to windmill uselessly as the engine seized. Still, the bomber flew on, now trailing a thin stream of black smoke from its damaged engine, but maintaining formation position with mechanical precision. Weber was beginning to feel something he hadn't experienced since his training days. Genuine fear. Not the healthy adrenaline rush of combat, but a cold, creeping terror that seemed to seep into his bones. He was witnessing something that violated every law of physics and aviation he had ever learned. As he prepared for yet another attack pass, Weber's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from his squadron leader, Major Heinrich Baer. All aircraft, break off attack immediately. Return to base for debriefing. Sir, we have a damaged bomber that's still flying without pilots. Request permission to continue engagement. Negative, Weber. I said break off attack, that's an order. Weber reluctantly turned away from the bomber formation, but not before taking one last look at All-American 3. The aircraft was now trailing smoke from its damaged engine, and had what appeared to be significant structural damage to its nose section, but it continued to maintain formation position with supernatural precision. As he watched, the bomber's ball turret gunner tracked his departing Messerschmitt with professional competence. How can dead men be so accurate? Weber wondered. During the flight back to Yevor Airfield, Weber's mind raced through possible explanations for what he had witnessed. Perhaps the co-pilot had survived the initial blast and taken control from the right seat. Maybe the aircraft was being flown from the navigator's position using emergency controls. But Weber had seen the destruction clearly through multiple attack passes. The entire forward section of the aircraft was gone. No human being could have survived that cannon burst. Could the Americans have developed some form of autopilot system sophisticated enough to maintain formation flight? Weber knew about the primitive C-1 autopilot system used in some B-17s, but it was notoriously unreliable and incapable of the precise control inputs required for formation flying. The more Weber thought about it, the more impossible the situation became. He had personally destroyed the bomber's cockpit, severed its primary flight control cables, and eliminated any possibility of human control. Yet All-American 3 had continued flying with the precision of a machine guided by an expert pilot. Back at Yevor Airfield, Weber's ground crew chief, Obergefreiter Hans Richter, noticed his pilot's pale complexion immediately as Weber climbed down from his Messerschmitt's cockpit. Herr Hauptmann, you look like you've seen a ghost, Richter observed, helping Weber remove his parachute harness. Weber's laugh was bitter and hollow. Hans, I think I have. The debriefing session that followed was unlike any Weber had experienced in 3 years of combat operations. Major Baer listened to his account with increasing skepticism, occasionally interrupting to ask for clarification on technical details. When Weber finished his report, Baer was silent for a long moment. Klaus, you're telling me that you completely destroyed an American bomber's cockpit, killing both pilots, yet the aircraft continued flying in formation for over an hour? That's correct, sir. And this bomber maintained precise formation position, made course corrections, and responded to tactical situations despite having no pilot. Yes, sir. Baer leaned back in his chair, studying Weber's face carefully. Klaus, you've been flying combat missions for 3 years. You have 47 confirmed kills. You're one of our most reliable pilots. But what you're describing is impossible. I know it's impossible, sir, but I know what I saw. 3 hours after Weber's encounter with the impossible, All-American 3 was approaching RAF Kimballton, its home base in Huntingdonshire, England. The bomber had flown over 200 miles across occupied Europe, navigated around German flak concentrations, and maintained formation with its squadron despite having no visible means of control. In the control tower at Kimballton, Flight Lieutenant James Morrison was monitoring radio traffic when he received a transmission that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Kimballton Tower, this is All-American 3 requesting emergency landing clearance. Morrison keyed his microphone. All-American 3, state the nature of your emergency. There was a pause, then a voice that sounded strained and disbelieving. Tower, we don't have a cockpit anymore. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Joe Sarnowski, the bomber's radio operator, who had crawled forward through the aircraft's cramped interior to reach the radio equipment that had somehow survived the German attack. What Sarnowski had found when he reached the forward section of the aircraft defied comprehension. The entire nose section forward of the wing root was simply gone. The cockpit, instrument panel, pilot and co-pilot seats, everything had been obliterated by the German cannon fire. Both pilots, Lieutenant John Morgan and Lieutenant Robert Campbell, had been killed instantly. Yet somehow, impossibly, the aircraft had continued flying itself home. All-American 3, did you say you don't have a cockpit? Morrison asked, certain he had misheard the transmission. That's affirmative, Tower. The entire nose section is gone. Both pilots are dead, but we're still flying. Morrison looked out the control tower windows at the approaching bomber formation. Even from a distance, he could see that something was wrong with the lead aircraft. Where there should have been a nose section, there appeared to be only empty space. What happened next would become one of the most documented, yet least understood incidents in aviation history. With Sarnowski relaying instructions from the surviving crew members, All-American 3 lined up for final approach to Kimbolton's main runway. The aircraft's landing gear extended normally, the hydraulic systems apparently undamaged by the German attack. The bomber's flaps deployed in proper sequence, and the aircraft descended toward the runway with a precision that would have impressed any flight instructor. Morrison watched in fascination and horror as the impossible bomber touched down on the runway's centerline with a gentle chirp of tires on concrete. The aircraft rolled out normally, its brakes functioning perfectly, before coming to a stop near the end of the runway. Only when the engines shut down and ground crews reached the aircraft did the full scope of the miracle become apparent. The entire nose section forward of the wing root was gone, not damaged, but completely absent. The cockpit area looked like it had been scooped out by a giant hand. Twisted metal framework was all that remained of what had once been the aircraft's control center. Yet All-American 3 had flown over 200 miles, navigated through enemy territory, maintained formation with its squadron, and executed a perfect landing without any human control whatsoever. The surviving crew members emerged from the aircraft in a state of shock. They had spent over 2 hours flying in an aircraft they knew was impossible to control, watching their dead bomber respond to flight situations with mechanical precision. Several crew members later reported that they had felt the aircraft making course corrections and altitude adjustments throughout the flight, as if guided by invisible hands. Technical Sergeant Mike Zuck, the flight engineer, was among the first to examine the destroyed cockpit area. "I've been working on B-17s for 2 years," he told investigators later. "What I saw was impossible. Every primary flight control cable was severed. The rudder pedals were gone. The control yokes were destroyed. There was no way anyone could have been flying that airplane. Yet fly it had." The All-American 3 incident was immediately classified at the highest levels by both American and German intelligence services. The U.S. Army Air Forces conducted an extensive investigation, interviewing every surviving crew member and analyzing the aircraft's wreckage with microscopic precision. Teams of engineers from Boeing, Wright Aeronautical, and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics examined every component of the bomber that could possibly explain its autonomous flight. Their conclusion, buried in classified files that wouldn't see daylight for decades, was stark in its simplicity. The observed flight characteristics of All-American 3 are technically impossible according to all known principles of aerodynamics and aircraft control systems. The Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress was a marvel of American engineering, but it was not designed for autonomous flight. The aircraft's critical systems included primary flight controls that were cable-operated and ran directly through the cockpit area that had been destroyed. Engine management required constant adjustments to throttle, mixture, and propeller pitch controls, all located in the now-absent cockpit. The bomber's primitive C-1 autopilot system was notoriously unreliable and incapable of the precise control inputs required for formation flying. According to Boeing's own engineering specifications, the B-17F had inherent stability issues that required human intervention. Without active pilot control, the aircraft would typically enter a spiral dive within 60–90 seconds due to its center of gravity and aerodynamic characteristics. Yet All-American III had flown for over 2 hours without any visible means of control, making course corrections, altitude adjustments, and even executing a precision landing that would have challenged an experienced pilot. Dr. Theodore von Karman, one of America's leading aeronautical engineers, was secretly briefed on the incident. His analysis, classified top secret and filed away in Pentagon archives, concluded that the event represented a fundamental violation of known aerodynamic principles that cannot be explained by current scientific understanding. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hauptmann Klaus Weber found himself the subject of intense scrutiny by Luftwaffe intelligence officers. His gun camera footage clearly showed his cannon shells destroying All-American III's cockpit section, yet the bomber had continued flying in formation for the remainder of the engagement. Weber was quietly transferred to a training squadron in Bavaria, officially for rest and recuperation, but actually to remove him from combat operations. When he attempted to discuss the incident with other pilots, he was warned by his commanding officer that such defeatist talk could result in court-martial proceedings for undermining German morale. The psychological impact of the incident spread through Luftwaffe fighter squadrons despite official attempts at suppression. Word of the ghost bomber passed from pilot to pilot in whispered conversations in mess halls and briefing rooms. Several veteran aces, men who had faced overwhelming odds against Allied fighters and bombers, requested transfers to other theaters rather than continue engaging American bomber formations. Oberst Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, received classified reports of similar incidents from other fighter units. Experienced pilots reported encounters with impossible American bombers that continued flying despite catastrophic damage that should have been instantly fatal. These reports were initially dismissed as combat fatigue or propaganda, but the accumulating evidence became impossible to ignore. By early 1944, German fighter pilot effectiveness against B-17 formations had decreased by an estimated 15 to 20%. Post-war analysis would reveal that this decline coincided directly with the spread of rumors about ghost bombers that couldn't be killed. The psychological warfare implications were staggering. The Luftwaffe had built its reputation on technical superiority and pilot skill. The idea that American bombers could somehow continue fighting even after suffering fatal damage struck at the core of German aerial doctrine. If bombers could fly without pilots, what was the point of targeting cockpits? If aircraft could survive impossible damage, how could they be defeated? The truth about All-American III would remain buried in classified files for decades after the war ended. The surviving crew members were sworn to secrecy and transferred to different units. The bomber's wreckage was quietly disposed of, and official records listed the incident as a mechanical malfunction of unknown origin. But the story didn't end there. Post-war interviews with German pilots revealed that over 40 Luftwaffe aces had reported similar encounters with impossible American bombers that continued flying despite catastrophic damage. Most had never filed official reports, fearing they would be declared mentally unfit for duty or accused of cowardice. Hauptmann Weber survived the war and eventually became a commercial airline pilot. In 1963, 20 years after his encounter with All-American III, he was interviewed by aviation historians researching unusual incidents from the war. Weber's account, recorded on tape and stored in the Smithsonian Institution's archives, provides a chilling first-hand description of the impossible. I had made that shot hundreds of times in training and 47 times in combat. I knew exactly what would happen when my shells hit that cockpit. The bomber should have gone down immediately, but it didn't. It just kept flying, as if nothing had happened, as if death itself meant nothing to it. Weber paused in the interview, his voice becoming quiet and distant. You have to understand, we were trained to believe in the superiority of German engineering and tactics. We were taught that American bombers were vulnerable, predictable targets. But that day I realized we were fighting something that didn't follow the rules of war or physics, something that couldn't be killed because it was already dead. The interviewer asked Weber if he believed the incident had been some form of advanced American technology, perhaps an early autopilot system or remote control device. Weber's response was immediate and emphatic. No, I've spent 20 years flying commercial aircraft. I understand autopilot systems, control mechanisms, all of it. What I saw that day wasn't technology. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. During ISU, modern aviation experts who have reviewed the declassified portions of the All-American 3 files remain baffled by the incident. Computer simulations using current aerodynamic modeling consistently show that the bomber should have crashed within minutes of losing its cockpit and primary flight controls. Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of aeronautical engineering at MIT who studied the incident in 2019, concluded, "Based on everything we know about aircraft design and flight dynamics, All-American 3 should have been uncontrollable the moment its cockpit was destroyed. The fact that it not only continued flying, but executed precise maneuvers and a successful landing represents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of aviation physics." The gun camera footage from Weber's Messerschmitt still exists in German military archives, digitally enhanced and analyzed frame by frame. The film clearly shows Weber's cannon shells destroying the bomber's cockpit section, yet also documents the aircraft's continued flight in formation. Aviation experts who have examined the footage describe it as the most compelling evidence of an impossible event in aviation history. Yet questions remain. How did All-American 3 fly for over 200 miles without human control? What guided its navigation across enemy territory? How did it execute course corrections and altitude adjustments? How did it perform a precision landing that challenged the skills of experienced pilots? The official answer, buried in classified files that may never be fully declassified, is simple. Nobody knows. Some researchers have theorized that the incident represents an early example of what would later be called automation, perhaps a secret American autopilot system, far more advanced than anything publicly acknowledged. Others suggest that surviving crew members somehow managed to control the aircraft from alternative positions, though technical analysis makes this explanation highly unlikely. But there's another possibility, one that aviation historians rarely discuss in official publications, that All-American 3 represents something beyond current scientific understanding, something that challenges our fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness, control, and mechanical systems. The legacy of All-American 3 extends far beyond a single impossible flight in December 1943. The incident marked a turning point in the psychological warfare of the European theater, demonstrating that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't superior technology or tactics, but the simple power of the impossible. For the German pilots who witnessed events like All-American 3, the war became something different, not just a contest of skill and technology, but a confrontation with forces that defied rational explanation. The knowledge that American bombers might continue fighting even after suffering fatal damage created a psychological burden that affected combat effectiveness throughout the remaining years of the war. For the American crews who flew these missions, incidents like All-American 3 became part of the folklore of the 8th Air Force, stories passed down from crew to crew about bombers that refused to die, about aircraft that somehow brought their crews home despite impossible damage. Today, nearly 80 years after that December morning over Bremen, the All-American 3 incident remains one of aviation's greatest unsolved mysteries. The aircraft that flew 200 miles without a cockpit, that landed safely despite having no means of control, that challenged everything we thought we knew about the laws of physics and aviation. The bomber and its crew have long since passed into history. Hauptmann Klaus Weber died in 1987, taking his memories of the impossible to the grave. The classified files remain locked away in government archives, their secrets protected by decades of bureaucratic inertia. But sometimes, on quiet December mornings when the winter light catches aircraft contrails just right, aviation enthusiasts claim they can still see ghost formations in the sky, bombers that fly without pilots, guided by invisible hands toward destinations that exist only in memory. Because some mysteries of war are too impossible to believe, yet too well documented to deny, and sometimes the most terrifying enemy is the one that refuses to stay dead. The ghost fortress flies on,